It must have been 7 or 8 years ago. I was walking home from work. I was walking down this street. I was going to have to turn left to go down the street I live on to my house. As I was walking, I was probably about 50 yards away from the turn. I noticed on the other side there was a dog. Big, red, brown, angry dog going ruff, ruff, ruff. I thought, oh my gosh. And as I got closer, the dog started running towards me. And at this point I realized the owner does not have control of their dog. No lead in sight, dog just running at me. So I'm now, I don't know, say 15, 20 yards away from my turn. I have no memory from that point until I'm rounding the corner and headed down the hill. As I'm running down the hill, I regain awareness and I'm thinking to myself, I think I remember reading that it's a bad idea to run away from dogs because they just run after you. And I thought, well, I've got two choices. I can keep running or I can stop, turn around, see if the dog's there. If I stop and turn around and the dog's there, I might get eaten by the dog, but I honestly feel a bit embarrassed now. I'm wearing a tie, school lanyard. You know, this might be embarrassing to have, you know, grown up running down a hill from nothing. So I think I'm just going to stop. I'm going to turn around. And so I stop, I turn around, dogs at the top of the hill barking. And I have that feeling that I think we can all relate to of where your body is just coming down from this really, really excited, stressed out state. And that was one of the times in my life where I really experienced a genuine fight, flight, or freeze moment. When I had my moment with the dog, it's really important to understand that my body was reacting the way it was supposed to, and really significantly, to the kind of stress that human bodies are good at dealing with. That kind of stress is very short-lived, very acute. Now that's the kind of stress that we used to deal with. And if you imagine hunter-gatherer out in prehistoric wilderness and suddenly comes across saber-toothed tiger, ah! That's what we're supposed to be dealing with. That's what our bodies and brains are adapted to. We're supposed to be encountering stress that lasts moments, seconds, probably not even minutes. And of course, as society and civilization has changed, the stresses that we face are really different, but our bodies haven't kept up. And so it's really important to understand that when you're dealing with a stressful situation or a student is dealing with a stressful situation, their bodies are reacting in a very primitive, very primal way. And so, for instance, if I give a student a test, let's say I'm a history teacher, and on that test it says, discuss the ramifications of the Weimar Republic's economic failures in terms of the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. Well, when I'm looking at that, I might be thinking, don't really know the answer to that. I'm quite panicked about this. My body is going, saber-toothed tiger! The way in which our bodies fail to deal with 21st century stress has very much to do with the evolution and structure of our brains. If you imagine your brain, at its very base, it has a section which we colloquially call the reptilian brain. We call it that because it's basically the part of a brain that a reptile has. It does all the very primitive stuff. So, going to the loo, running around, eating stuff. If a reptile can do it, it's contained in that part of the brain. Now, that's a really essential part of the brain for our survival. Around that is another section, which is called the midbrain. And the midbrain crucially contains a lot of our emotional centers. And so when you have an emotional reaction, there is electrical activity in that part of your brain. Surrounding that is a part of the brain called the neocortex. Now, the neocortex is where complex thoughts happen, where advanced memory functions happen. It's funny, but for us it's considered very vital. I mean, without that, we're not really human beings. From a base survival standpoint, it's the least important part of our brain. And when we're dealing with saber-toothed tiger moments, that's the bit of our brain that our body says you don't need. You don't need the neocortex. You don't need to know this stuff. And so what happens is the midbrain senses a strong, powerful emotional reaction, and what it does is it turns off the switch. It's the electrical gatekeeper between the reptilian brain and the neocortex. It shuts off all electrical activity going to your neocortex. When you have that sensation, which we've all had of, and then my mind went blank. That's not a metaphor, that's not a figure of speech. Your mind literally goes blank. The theater of consciousness that you're watching disappears because there's no electrical activity going to it. And so that's why when, for instance, the dog ran after me, I couldn't remember what happened between moment of stress response and rounding the corner because my midbrain had shut off all the electricity to my higher order thinking, to my higher thoughts, and to a sense, my awareness of what was going on. It was just like my brain was sending memos going, "We're running, okay?" After a few seconds, I got the memos and went, "Oh, running, okay." So when a child, a student, has a stress response, their neocortex is no longer available to them. It's also important to remember it happens to you too. As a teacher, we will go through moments where we get emotional and stressed out in school environments, and we have that same shutdown. And it's important to understand when it happens to you or when it happens to a student, you're not at your best. And you have to take that into account. So a student who needs information from their neocortex can't get it, it's not available. And so what we need to consider is how do we create an environment where the light switch is turned back on and the student can once again access higher order thinking and can get at the information we need them to get at. If all we're doing is reinforcing the stressfulness of their situation, that light switch is never going to get turned back on. So you might be thinking, well, that's all well and good, but why do I have some students who seemingly can deal with stress and they don't go into these flight, fight, or freeze moments, and then I have other students who seem to explode kind of constantly? Surely there's something wrong with them. Well, there is, but it's not their fault. And the problem has to do, again, with how our primitive brains deal with stress. So when you have a stress response, two things happen. The first is the release of a neurotransmitter called adrenaline, and that affects you electrically. So it's like a light switch, and you have the stress response, the electricity goes, and then the stress response leaves, and the electricity vanishes from your system. And that is, an acute response. It's time-wise, it takes up a very, very small amount of time. The other thing that happens is your body releases a chemical called cortisol into your bloodstream. Now, being a chemical in your bloodstream, it can't just vanish. And so what happens is you have a stress response, cortisol gets released into your system, and slowly fades away. You've probably experienced this yourself when you've had some kind of stressful reaction, like, for instance, if you almost are in a car crash. So you're driving along, car comes out, and you stop, no car crash happens, other car speeds away, and there's that feeling, that rush of, it's literally chemicals draining from your system, but you can feel it. Like your skin feels, tangibly alive in a way that it normally doesn't, and over time that dissipates, and that's the feeling of cortisol leaving your body. Now, what happens is you have this rush of cortisol and then it starts to fade, and what can happen, of course, is you can have another stress response before all the cortisol's gone. And when that happens, you have this rising wave of cortisol. Now, there is a level that when the cortisol reaches that level, you go into your flight, fight, or freeze response. Now, if you live in a chronically stressful environment, you can easily imagine you're living just under that. And so anything that happens, you fly over that. So if we're talking about our students, we have students who have chaotic homes. We have students who have physiological difficulties. We have students who live just below that stress threshold. And so it's important to understand, if you have a student that seems to explode constantly, it's probably that their life is very chaotic and they're existing at this level. Imagine how difficult that must be. That you're constantly being thrown into this territory where electrochemically you aren't in control. And you can see in some of our students, that's how they live. They're constantly out of control. Now, what we need to do is manage those situations and understand the reason behind those situations, and more importantly, really, understand what we can do to help.